Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining Dramatically Improving Outcomes for English Language Learners. My name is Anna Tilton, and I am the Executive Director for Grantmakers for Education. Today's webinar is brought to you by Grantmakers for Education in partnership with W.K. Kellogg Foundation. The purpose of today's program is twofold. First, to build the field's knowledge of opportunities to invest in improved outcomes for English language learners, and secondly, to highlight strategies identified in Grantmakers for Education report. The report is entitled Educating English Language Learners, Grant-Making Strategies for Closing America's Other Achievement Gap. GFE's mission is to strengthen philanthropy's capacity to improve education outcomes for all learners, an effort we accomplish by offering impactful place-based and e-based programming. Knowledge products such as benchmarking, which provides data and analysis on the latest trends in education philanthropy. GFE's 2012 benchmarking report highlighted that 92% of our members were interested in grant making to vulnerable populations, including achievement gaps for low-income or minority students as a priority. However, 55% of our funders are making grants to support English language learners and immigrants. Although benchmarking is critical to helping us better serve our members, you can find other helpful reports available on our website. Because of this gap between what our funders were interested in and what they were funding, we have pulled together an amazing panel for your pleasure today. Before jumping into our presentation, please let me take a minute to highlight a few of our webinar platform key elements. Because the lines will be muted, you can easily submit questions throughout the presentation using the Chat with Presenter dialog box in the left panel of your screen. Our colleague here at GFE will be fielding questions for the moderator to pose to speakers throughout the webinar. You may also raise your hand if you would like to, like the moderator or facilitator, to chat directly with you regarding a particular question. Finally, for better viewing experience, please feel free to select full screen in the top right-hand corner of the page. If at any time during the webinar you have logistical challenges, please dial 1-800-246-1442. I'm going to repeat that, 1-800-246-1442. You will also need to provide an access code. The access code is 595-2100 for immediate assistance. This number and access code can also be found in your invitation. At the end of today's presentation, the full web and audio file will be available for you as an MP4 file. We will also post slides and a recording of the webinar on GFE's website. Let me also take a minute today to thank today's presenters. This includes Dr. Libia Gil of the Department of Education and Rosann Tung of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. And now I'm pleased to introduce to you our moderator, Lauren Wolkov, Executive Director of Central Valley Foundation. Lauren has experience in management in both private and nonprofit sectors. She served a total of 17 years as a director of a corporate foundation, a community foundation, and a public foundation. Having served as the head of the Central Valley Foundation for the past 6 years, she brings 20 years of experience working with and on behalf of children and families in the field of philanthropy. Again, thank you all for joining us. And with that, I will turn the virtual baton over to Lauren.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that GFE is hosting this webinar on English language learners. It is an area of increasing need throughout the entire United States, where 11%, over 5 million students, are English language learners. In California, we have over 25% are English language learners. We are seeing an increasing focus on ELLs among educators, funders, and businesses. There also are significant changes within the education field as the new Common Core standards are adopted and beginning to be implemented. Common Core presents both opportunities and an increased need to address language and literacy issues for English language learners. An example of the increased interest in ELLs among funders is that over 60 funders registered for this webinar. So that we might all have some information about each other, would you please just look at these 2 quick questions that will soon be on your screen regarding your foundation's current investments in ELLs, and please submit your answer. The responses for the first question of do you currently invest in ELLs is we have 6 people have answered yes and 2 have answered no. So we can go to the next question. If you are funding ELLs, at which levels are you funding or working? And you can answer as many of those that are applicable as for your foundation. So the responses so far, we have 3 are funding individual schools or individual programs. 1 is a single district. 2 are multiple districts. 2 for professional development, and 2 on public policy. I appreciate your sharing that information with us. Okay. Before we hear from our 2 noted speakers, let's just take a few minutes to quickly recall the highlights of GFE's report, Educating English Language Learners, which was published in 2013 in April. This report was generously funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and I, along with 7 GFE colleagues, were proud to serve on the advisory committee. The methodology of this study involved an online survey which was sent to 138 funders, which was then completed by 57 of those funders. Detailed phone interviews were also had with 24 of the 57 respondents. The report also consists of 4 case studies about specific successful programs for ELLs, including a parent-childhood education program, a pre-K to 3rd grade model of language learning, and an assessment for young dual language learners. We can look at our next slide. This tells us the state of the moment, so to speak, for ELLs. And I don't need to read it all to you because I'm sure you're able to see it, but for some people it is a surprise about who the ELL students are, particularly that 75% in K through 5th grade are 2nd and 3rd generation Americans. And the next slide, it shows the academic challenges that ELLs have. And the next one, it shows that there's a heterogeneous group and that the ELLs are geographically dispersed. They're no longer in the 6 main states, which it had been previously, and California being one of them. Now, to help us better understand the implications of these demographic changes and the educational needs of ELLs and the way that funders can improve the outcome for ELLs, let's hear from our first presenter, Dr. Libby Gil. Dr. Gil was appointed last month as the Assistant Deputy Secretary and Director of the Office of English Language Acquisition at the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to joining the department, Libby served as Vice President at the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning in Chicago. She was also a Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the American Institutes for Research, where she developed and co-led its Center for English Learners. Libby began her career as a teacher in Los Angeles and later was a bilingual resource specialist. Her education career includes serving as a principal, assistant superintendent, and superintendent, for which she has received multiple awards. As a superintendent in California, she also institutionalized dual language programs in Spanish. Libby earned her Doctor of Philosophy degree in Curriculum and Instruction with an emphasis in bilingual education from the University of Washington. Libby, welcome.
Thank you, Lauren, for the nice introduction and also this opportunity to participate in today's discussion. Hello, everyone out there. I don't know if I should say good morning or good afternoon. I know we're crossing different time zones, but in any case, a good morning or good afternoon to all of you. So Lauren has provided a good kind of a high-level national profile for English language learners. So in my section, in a short period of time, I'd like to expand on the profile by providing a brief state and local overview, and then jump into what I see as the common challenges across states and districts. I will then suggest a conceptual framework to consider in identifying opportunities for systemic change to support the success for English language learners, and conclude with the role of the U.S. Department of Education, highlighting some current research efforts and thoughts. So our first slide is the demographics of ELs, and by the way, we kind of use that synonymously, both English learners and English language learners, so I'm going to shorten it to ELs. And please note that approximately half of the total numbers of ELs are found in 5 states. So in the next several slides, in order to minimize confusion, I will try and point out that some of the data is reported in numbers and others are percentages, and I'll try and make that distinction when we break down the various figures between K-12 students enrolled in our public school system and, of course, all ELs, which includes pre-K learners. So the U.S. Census Bureau has predicted that by 2025, about 40% of our K-12 enrolled students will be classified as ELs. That just emphasized the kind of growth rate that Lauren indicated in the previous slide, which was a 60% growth rate at this point. And at the rate we're growing, we're looking at a major number or percentage of our student population as ELs in the future. The next slide, you can clearly see that the largest EL language group by number is Spanish. Spanish speakers actually account for about approximately 80% of all English learners currently. Please note that there is not a breakdown for Chinese, which has many dialects that are very distinctive depending on the region. But the dominant ones are Cantonese and Mandarin, which is the national dialect. Also note that the Hmong language is an oral language and doesn't have a written or a literacy component that is similar to other languages. The next slide actually shows another view of EL's distribution by states in percentage format with student enrollment at the top and also with all ELs at the bottom, which includes, again, the early learners pre-K from 3 to 5-year-olds, that students who are, or learners who are not in the K-12 system. Moving on to the top 10 states with highest percentages of EL, which alters a little bit the ranking from the top 5 numbers we saw earlier. What you see here now is New Mexico, Nevada, which is one of the fastest growing Hispanic populations in the country. Over 40% are now in Clark County and in the Las Vegas area. And of course, Colorado now is in the top 5 on this particular chart. Moving back to numbers, the top 10 districts in the country with the largest enrolled ELs. This chart just gives you a good overview. There's a lot of alignment with the top states, of course. You see Los Angeles right there as number 1, followed by New York, and again Clark County, which includes Las Vegas, Miami-Dade, and Dallas. Now shifting to what I would identify as the most common challenges both for states and districts level. Obviously there are many issues and questions to address, so let me just highlight a few of them. One of the most fundamental challenges is that there is a great variation between state definitions of ELs in terms of how they are classified and reclassified. When we talk about reclassification, we're talking about exiting from the EL category or programs. And these processes also vary not only from state to state, but also from district to district within a state. Obviously, there's implications for assessment, which is an absolutely critical issue for accurate classification. What is appropriate that is valid and reliable to distinguish measurements for academic content, for example, in contrast to English language skills? I know that our next speaker, Rosann Tung, will elaborate on this issue. Now, assuming that a student has been appropriately classified, what are the right support and services that take into account the diversity of EL backgrounds? In the earlier slides that Lauren showed, the multiple categories and differentiated experiences that ELs come to our school system. And an example is, a very clear example is a newcomer coming to this country with very limited or interrupted formal education experience would need very different supports from a long-term EL who is born in this country, could be second or third generation. The whole issue and question of data collection is a challenge for all students, but in particular for English language learners. Common data collection, reporting and using data to inform practice is an ongoing one. But again, particularly for EL, since few systems are really prepared to disaggregate the data with the right questions and useful applications. Excuse me. The staffing and capacity development issue is one that could take a whole session in and of itself, because we're talking about building the pipeline, we're talking about certification and preparation for EL, teachers of ELs, but that actually now translates into all teachers. So we have to think about the kind of capacity development, the kind of professional development that is appropriate for all teachers, in addition to those who may be specializing in a bilingual program or an EL certification program. And of course, the last bullet I think is rather self-explanatory. The funding issue is one that is perpetual, it seems like, both at the local, state, and now at the federal level. So what can we do differently to promote sustainable change for supporting English learners? I'm making some suggested, what I'm going to call guiding principles for systemic efforts, emphasizing a holistic approach to avoid the typical isolated and or fragmented activities or episodic program attempts. So what I'm suggesting is that we think alignment, coherence, and comprehensive practices across 3 basic components of a school or district system when we think of units of change. It might be useful to consider this as a simplified framework for education change, understanding that all three components, culture, instruction, and structure, are essential to address, in particular, if ELs are fast becoming, quote, the mainstream population. So I've identified some examples under each component, which again, Rosann will also be speaking to, particularly the first two components. But very briefly, culture defined as really the valuing of the benefits of multilingualism, understanding the advantages of maintaining heritage language and connections to culture for student success, academic success. There's a linkage. Understanding that practicing inclusion, including student, parent, and family voice in the education process, particularly parents who themselves are English language learners, is absolutely critical in defining a culture of valuing and that is strengths-based and looking at the richness that English language learners bring to our education system. Along with that, I don't think we can really expect sustainable change over time unless we address pedagogy, which is the practices between the teacher, the content, and the students, the level of engagement, the level of collaboration, and of course understanding that academic language development is very, very different from social language development. And then finally, the third component is the structure. This is where we can think about the way a district or a school is organized that will support English learners, including what I mentioned earlier, the capacity development, the kind of policy that would support appropriate resource allocation, which includes time and expertise, materials, all kinds of outreach efforts to really engage not only the students but also families and community members in this effort. So that's a very brief highlight of the basic components. We can add more to this, but the suggestion here is that unless these three components are touched, it will be a very major challenge to think about a comprehensive, aligned, and coherent system moving forward to support our English learners. So what is the Department of Education doing about English learners? We have just a big list of current activities that is an investment in supporting English learners. I'll just point out a few key ones for you. Title III is dedicated to supporting English language learners through preparation and training of teachers, evaluation activities, as well as having a clearinghouse for dissemination of research-based information on effective methods, programs, and strategies for ELs. This is two different divisions of Title III. There's a formula grant that is driven by the number of English language learners in each state, as well as discretionary grants that really focus on providing technical assistance as well as monitoring support. Most of you are probably familiar with the Promised Neighborhoods program, which really targets a comprehensive, what is called a cradle to career continuum of services in a community. Just be aware that there are currently 22 grantees, and all of them are in communities which serves a large population of EL students, from anywhere from 25% to 40% of the participants who speak languages other than English. And of course, you know, Race to the Top and what is commonly called as the I3 grants, all of those major initiatives that are currently in effect have large components supporting and identifying the ways to address English language learners. Also want to continue to talk about what the department is currently doing for research and investment opportunities. I've mentioned Race to the Top. The other component of that one is the school improvement programs, teacher preparation programs. These are just a listing of current topics that we are in the midst of studying. For example, we're expecting a practice guide to come out really soon. It's a revision and an update of very specific instructional approaches for ELs in elementary grades, as well as looking at how the promising schools models or exemplary schools can be identified and shared more broadly. Additional topics that we are contemplating right now is the whole assessment question, looking at it from a systems perspective. I mentioned earlier how difficult it is because we don't have all the tools, certainly not all common tools across states, as well as having really reliable and ballot measures to make sure that we are measuring content and not English proficiency, which many of our assessments typically do. The question of processes for identifying and classifying ELs, as well as the impact or implications for ELs when other new initiatives are unfolding, the launching of Common Core, what does that mean for ELs? What is the career and college pathways and goals? How are we doing with ELs within those initiatives and along with highly qualified or effective teachers? And I'm sure you have heard, if not, it's coming out real soon. The department is very interested in looking at teacher preparation programs and actually rating colleges similar to accountability systems that we are currently doing with the K-12 system. Embedded in all of these issues or topics are questions of implications for EL. So we want to make sure that whatever other initiatives are going on, we also pay attention to what's happening and what is the implication for EL practices. The timing is very, very good right now. I have a slide here that I would encourage and actually invite everybody to participate, anyone interested, in helping us identify key priorities. So what you see on this slide is a request for RFI, which is a request for information. And what we're doing is soliciting from the field and anyone interested. Where you see gaps and have a lot of questions, we want to prioritize what it is we want to study moving forward. And just to note that there is an October 9th deadline that has been extended to October 15th because we really want to hear from the field and those of you who are really involved with the work here, what is it that is missing for you? Where are the gaps that we can help address and prioritize limited resources for future investment? So with that, I'm going to stop and I believe take questions for a couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Libby. And if people could just send your questions through the chat, and then we will ask them, we'll read them and ask Libby to address them. So while we're waiting for that, Libby, could you maybe share with us what information your department would have that would be helpful to funders who might be just beginning to fund ELLs or maybe looking at expanding their support of English language learners?
Yes, we have a lot of data that could be helpful, and obviously this was a very quick overview, but we could disaggregate data further by states, for example, particularly since we work in all the states. If there's a particular interest in a region or a different language group to target, we can help retrieve and collect and present data in different formats for interested funders, because I do understand that some funders are interested in particular regions and looking at other areas of interest of reform, we can also help, as I mentioned earlier, ways to align and integrate with other programs going on, and be glad to provide technical assistance. I should mention that we have just completed a process of awarding a group for technical assistance. We call it the National Clearinghouse. And this particular group can also be very, very helpful in providing webinars, for example, conferences on different topics, looking for research on particular topics, again, depending on what a funder might have particular interest in and want to go deeper in.
Thank you. And we do have a question, and it says, can you talk a little more about the emphasis and support in the most recent Race to the Top district applications, due tomorrow, I think, to incentivize districts to focus on ELL students?
I'd love to talk about that, and I do have general information. I should, you mentioned that I was appointed last month. Actually, I'm just starting my 3rd week in the department. So yes, there is a lot of different extra points given to proposals that address English language learners within the Race to the Top. But we're also looking at particularly learning more about interventions and practices from the current group of districts that are doing this work. And part of Race to the Top really looks at English language learners as part of the entire group of students that may not be, well, let me put it another way. The concern is making sure that the gap is decreasing, so that we're looking at both the English language learners as a group, comparing it to other groups of students in the district. So it could be academic achievement, it could be graduation rates, it could be all of the data that we currently ask districts to collect, and looking at accessibility and equitable distribution of highly effective or highly qualified teachers would be another category. So there's a list of practices that we would encourage for all students, but in particular for English language learners.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Libby at the moment? There'll be an opportunity before the conclusion to ask some questions at that time as well. Okay, then thank you, Libby, for these remarks. It's impressive that you are on the webinar after just being 3 weeks on the job, but I know you have a lot of background and experience in the field of education, specifically English language learners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now our next presenter is Dr. Rosann Tung, and Rosann leads a research and policy team at Annenberg Institute, conducting original research, documentation and evaluation of reform efforts, analysis of current education policies, and the development of tools to share lessons and best practices. As part of her previous work as founding director of research and evaluation at the Center for Collaborative Education in Boston, she reviewed English language learner education in urban districts. She was lead author of a chapter in Forbidden Language, English Learners and Restrictive Language Policies. She currently serves on the board of TURC, which is a nonprofit dedicated to innovations in K-12 STEM teaching and learning. Rosann earned a PhD in biological and biomedical sciences from Harvard University. Welcome, Rosann.
Thank you, and thanks for having me present today. I think my comments align and build off Dr. Gil's framework very nicely. This first slide just gives you an overview of some of the information that I'm going to present today. First, I recently guest edited an issue of Annenberg's quarterly called Voices in Urban Education, and in it the authors all promoted an asset-based perspective on English language learner education. And by asset-based, I mean a view that our English language learners bring rich experiences and cultural and linguistic gifts to our schools and communities. So rather than sort of promoting or participating in the dominant discourse of failure around English language learners, the articles cover effective school models, effective pre-service and in-service professional development programs, and districts and community-based organizations and parent organizing perspectives that all use an asset-based approach. So during my time today, I'm going to be contrasting the sort of deficit model with this asset-based approach. I've also been involved in a series of studies through a collaboration among the Boston Public Schools, the Gaston Institute at UMass Boston, and the Center for Collaborative Education, where I did research before moving to Annenberg. So I've studied enrollment, engagement, and outcomes of English language learners in urban districts. And we found many issues in assessment, identification, program choices, and program consistency and quality. We also had the fortune of being able to study exemplary schools, so schools that do well by English language learners. And we were able to spend some time in those schools and look at the culture and instruction going on there. So today, the studies of Boston and other urban districts, as well as the articles in The View, inform the recommendations that I'll talk about at the end. So this slide just shows the proverbial achievement gap. You can see in the top row the pass rates of English language learners in the state test for Massachusetts, compared in the bottom row with the pass rates for English proficient students. And as you can see, there's a 18 to 35 percentage point difference between the pass rates of the two groups. And this shows English language arts, but this sort of pattern holds true for the other content areas, math and science. This slide shows these light peach-colored rows in which the English language learners are divided into their English proficiency levels, with one being students at the beginning levels of English language development, and 5 being students who are ready to transition to mainstream classes. And as you can see, at the lower English proficiency levels, not surprisingly, English language learner students do not pass at high rates. However, at levels 4 and 5, as you can see on this slide under the black line, English language learners not only approach, but surpass English proficient students in pass rates. So the achievement gap disappears when English language learners have learned English. Our studies have also confirmed others that in terms of student engagement indicators, English language learners typically have higher attendance rates, lower suspension rates, and lower transfer rates than English proficient students. So here's one of my comparison slides that just sort of reiterate what I just said, which is that the subtractive or deficit model says there is an achievement gap, but we show that there's no achievement gap when English language learners are actually becoming proficient in academic English. And we also want to point out that the current model is that there's annual assessments in English only for school and district accountability, but that it would make more sense to have annual assessments after students have learned the English necessary to interpret the assessment. So this slide, Dr. Gil alluded to the point I'm going to make with this slide, which shows a sort of a plethora of all the possible program models that a district could use to educate their English language learners. Since different families will prefer different models, it's important that districts provide a range of options for its families. However, our research shows that many districts choose one model for the vast majority of its students, the structured English immersion model, in which English language learners are typically grouped separately from English proficient students, and they're taught in English only. We also have found, as others have, that the first one, dual language bilingual programs, have the best outcomes for students. In the dual language models, English language learners and learners of another language are in the same classes and spend time learning content either in their native language or in a second language. And there are several articles in the View that present those models at the elementary level and at the high school level, showing the benefits to both English language learners and English proficient students, both academically and socially. So the second point I want to make about this slide is just that no matter what models districts choose, it's really important that those models be well defined and then monitored and evaluated so that locally people know what works best for their particular students. So again, the deficit model for English language learner programs is the structured English immersion model, where English is used in the classroom and students lose their home language. And the bilingual and dual language models are asset-based because they manage to use the home language to learn academic English. So as I mentioned, we did case studies of schools that were beating the odds with their English language learners, and we identified those schools while controlling for the school's students' income levels and their percent limited English proficient students. And one of the most striking findings was that in all 4 case study schools, the principals themselves had been English language learners, had been teachers in bilingual education programs, and therefore shared cultural and linguistic experiences with the ELLs in their schools. So because these principals shared experiences with ELLs, they were able to carry out this vision of cultural competence that Dr. Gil referred to, so that they promoted the idea that it wasn't just an awareness and a respect of differences in the school, but also that the staff had the ability to translate that cultural competence to actually changes in pedagogy. Sorry. So principals having that vision meant that they also staffed their buildings with people who shared, as much as possible, with people who shared cultural and linguistic experiences with their ELLs. And what that meant was in the buildings that we visited, we felt that they were places for students to have a chance to build positive identities as English language learners and as bilingual students, and that there was a climate of safety and belonging not only for the students, but also for their parents and families. So again, often in schools with increasing numbers of English language learners, the culture of the building is that one which places the burden on families to understand and adapt to the U.S. public school culture, and also one in which many adults in the building feel that they can't communicate with the parents because English is the dominant language and there are not many people in the building who can speak the ELL languages. In an asset-based model, the school intentionally prepares itself for English language learner students and families by ensuring that families feel comfortable communicating with adult representatives at the school. And they develop a cadre of parent volunteers from different linguistic groups. We also found in the case study schools that there was a stance that all teachers were teachers of English language learners, not just the ones who were ESL teachers or the ones who had the level 1 and 2 students in them. as a result of the principals' backgrounds, many of the people they hired already came dual licensed with ESL and with content, and most teachers were trained to scaffold the learning of content through English. What we found when we went into the classrooms was that teachers had instructional practices that were highly effective to teach not only English language learners, but really all students, and they included in the early grades storytelling in 2 languages, uploading vocabulary before group read-alouds in English, identifying common cognates between Spanish and English to teach vocabulary, differentiated instruction for small groups. In every classroom that we observed, students were not only listening to English, but they were also given opportunities to both to speak, read, and write English with each other English language learners, but also with native English speakers. There was intentional grouping during classroom time. So again, around quality teaching, we often see that teachers in the mainstream classroom are not prepared and not open to having English language learners in their classrooms, even the ones at levels 4 and 5, and that in many of these schools, English language learners spend almost all of their day, besides lunch and recess, with other English language learners exclusively. In the asset-based model, all teachers embrace the value that English language learners bring to their classroom. They learn from them, and they have native English speakers learning from English language learners as well. Another observation that was brought out in one of the articles in Voices in Urban Education was just that there are 10 states with the highest growth in the population of English language learners over the last 10 years, and they're listed in this slide along with the amount of growth. We also found that the dollars spent per pupil in these states ranged from $0 to $741 per year, and that there were no consistent formulas for calculating ELL expenditures among these states. We also know that in successful large urban districts, they typically spend from $2,500 to $5,000 per ELL student per year on top of the student allocation. So there are clearly funding equity issues in these states. So now I'm just going to quickly go over some recommendations at different levels. First, around research. The model that we used in Boston, where the district partnered with research organizations long-term with a series of studies, meant that trust was built between the researchers and the practitioners, and that the findings could be more relevant to the practitioners as they emerged, rather than years down the line when they're published in an academic journal. As you saw, we really believe that all research on English language learner outcomes should be disaggregated by native language as well as by English language development level. Around assessments, reiterating Dr. Gill's point, assessments always need to be valid and reliable, and they need to accurately measure English language development levels as well as content knowledge. Therefore, in terms of content, students need to be able to comprehend the test. One area of research that we feel is necessary is that students typically travel through the first 2 levels of English language proficiency rapidly, but then plateau at level 3. So what is the typical English language learner trajectory, and how can we improve upon it? And the last point, because I'm running out of time on this slide, is just that we really need to document what the program and school models are and how they should be implemented, and also what their outcomes are for various English language learner groups. Around district practice and policy, we certainly think that districts should promote the asset-based vision for English language learner education and change the paradigm from the deficit model to this model, that they should come up with a range of program model choices, including more students in dual language schools, and also developing newcomer centers that help students who are arriving as teens with no English. Districts should also think about staffing with bilingual and bicultural principals and staff. And the school level recommendations mirror some of what I have just said, that there definitely should be the opportunity to use native language to teach academic English, and the stance that everybody is an ELL teacher. The implication for that is that pre-service pipelines should just automatically dual certify teachers. And finally, some higher level recommendations include in assessment policy, refraining from annual testing of students until they've reached ELD levels sufficient to understand the tests, guidance from the DOE or states on equitable funding, and also the more advocacy for greater state funding for English language learners. And my last slide just provides some links to the studies from which some of my comments come from, the Voices in Urban Education issue, and my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosann. Please remember to submit the questions for Rosann in the chat, and then we will ask her directly. And while we're waiting for those questions, Rosann, the information you gave shows a very comprehensive elements for school districts. But what if we are looking at some school districts that are not quite that comprehensive? They don't have everything aligned as you are recommending. What, from a funder's perspective, what do you suggest?
So your question has to do with districts who maybe haven't had the time to develop a systemic approach to English language learner education.
Right.
And I would say that our findings really suggest that the vision from the district around cultural competence and the staffing for cultural competence is really important, and that if you don't have the staff or leadership who have those shared cultural and linguistic experiences with the ELLs, then it's important to intentionally structure opportunities for teachers to learn and for students to share their identities. So really it's the schools having a stance that it's their business to understand the student culture.
Okay, thank you. And we do have time for a question, and the question is, have you done any research that looks at the quality of the ELL certifications in higher ed?
Actually, I have not done any research on that. I think that my opinion about higher ed ELL certification is that hopefully in the future there will be more that are practice-based and competency-based rather than just passing sort of an ESL certification test, so that teacher candidates emerge having spent time in practicums in front of English language learners and trying on the practices that scaffold the learning of English.
Okay. Thank you very much. And if there are other questions, again, at the end, we will open it up to both Libby and Rosann. So next is I have been asked to briefly share with you a summary of the work that the S.H. Cal Foundation and the Central Valley Foundation have done with a very dynamic school district in Central California called the Sanger Unified School District. This district has 11,000 students, of which 25% are English language learners and 80% qualify for free lunch. We actually had Sanger's superintendent and assistant superintendent present with us at a session at GFE's conference last year in Brooklyn. Our work with Sanger also is one of the 4 case studies in the GFE report, Educating English Language Learners. A little background about the Central Valley Foundation is that since our inception in 1994, our grants have been focused for English language learners. This year, over 92% of all of our grants, which is approximately $1.2 million, will be for ELLs in selected public school districts in the Central Valley of California. Our funding strategies have evolved from funding specific programs for ELLs at individual schools, using anecdotal stories as our evaluations, to now we are funding school districts for a minimum of 3 years and having an expert independent evaluator who is using data to do the evaluation and analysis. Included in our criteria now is that we will only fund districts which have a minimum of 20% of its students who are English language learners. District leadership and commitment to ELLs is another priority, but has been a bit more challenging to identify and quantify. Our work with Sanger is an example of 3 key funding strategies. 1, collaboration at many levels. 2, starting with a relatively small project, which as it met with success, was expanded to a district-wide project. And 3, using data and an independent evaluator. We collaborated with the Cal Foundation, which first funded a literacy program at 4 elementary schools in Sanger in 2007. Cal quickly expanded its support for leadership teams in the district, an evaluation by Stanford University, and support for district reform. As part of the Central Valley's Foundation change of direction to a district-wide approach, Ken Doan of the Cal Foundation recommended that we consider funding Sanger. In 2009, we funded an English language learner assessment at 6 elementary schools at Sanger. This program met with impressive success, and in 2011, at the request of the district, Central Valley Foundation funded this program for all of Sanger's schools. We contracted with Dr. Kenji Hakuda at Stanford University to conduct an independent evaluation of this program, which showed the positive impact of it. The success of Sanger became well known in California, and the district hosted more than 400 visitors from other school districts in a year. Everyone wanted to know how to duplicate Sanger's success. They wanted to know what the silver bullet was that Sanger had. Of course, as you all know, there is no silver bullet in trying to help English language learners, but rather a multi-layered, comprehensive, leadership-intensive approach to the success of Sanger. In response to requests for duplicating and mentoring its approach and programs, Sanger applied for a federal I-3 grant, which actually was denied. Our foundation, however, was aware of its application and worked with Sanger to fund a portion of its original I-3 proposal. Beginning in 2011, our foundation funded a 3.5-year project in which Sanger is mentoring Firebaugh Los Deltas District, which is located 60 miles away, but has similar demographics. The results of this collaboration are now being documented by 2 independent evaluators and are showing impressive results. So though we did not formally collaborate with the U.S. Department of Education, we were involved at some level in supporting one of its initiatives. I think you might also be interested to know that both the Cal Foundation and the Central Valley Foundation have funded networks of our school districts that are data-based. In 2010, the Cal Foundation funded the Stanford ELL Leadership Network, which involves 7 districts in California. This year, the Central Valley Foundation funded the Data Network, which also is connected with Stanford University and involves the 5 districts that we fund. The Stanford ELL Leadership Network has provided reports about ELLs at the individual school districts, which have then developed action plans to address some of the needs that have been identified. All the districts in these 2 networks agree to share their data with each other. The districts have learned some very surprising information about their ELLs, including their long-term ELLs. These networks are another example of the positive impacts of districts collaborating and sharing data and action plans about English language learners. It also demonstrates the importance of collecting data, understanding the data, and how to change instruction based upon the data. I have just briefed you about 2 examples of programs for ELLs that have been successful, but GFE's report provides many others. You will note that on page 9 of the report there is a summary of other effective strategies to improve ELL outcomes, including professional development for teachers, teacher recruitment, expanded day, summer programs, advocacy, and leadership development. On page 12 of this report, there also are lessons for philanthropy that I think might be of interest to you. I realize that Libby, Rosann, and I have shared a large amount of information and diverse information in a short time frame. So I would like now to take the next 8 to 10 minutes for questions for any of us, including Anna at GSE. Well, perhaps I can ask a question of the listeners. Is there specific information that you would like in order to assist you with your funding for English language learners? Okay. Libby or Rosann, do you have any questions that you would like to pose?
Well, similar to your question, Lauren, I would be interested in hearing what other information is needed to help foundations and funders think about this area as an investment area. Some specifics around either strategies or knowledge gap, which is part of the evaluation that I was soliciting earlier, topics for that, but practices and more about the effective models that you have just started to identify.
Okay.
If those are the kinds of things that would be helpful.
Okay, I think those are good questions. And I was asked a question. It looks like for me, but other people can comment. And the question is, what does your evaluation of your initiative look like? Research, surveys, etc. Our evaluation looks at their children's SELT scores, which is a test that's given in California only to English language learners, and evaluates their proficiency level, as well as the standards test, which is in our state is called CST. So it looks specifically at the scores of the children who were in our programs and compares them to those who were not. And then once it goes district-wide, it compares it to how the changes have occurred during the years that the program was in place. So it's very data-driven. Dr. Hakuda also does attend some of the lessons, some of the sessions. So he does evaluations of the classroom and will meet with the school district afterwards and share some of his observations. He's looking particularly at the time that children, English language learners, get to speak, get to be engaged, as well as some of the approaches that the teachers are using. So there's that component as well. In one of our programs, we even asked the students, as a summer school program, what do they think has been their improvement of their English language. And interestingly enough, the kids at the end of the summer school thought that they did not do as well as when they first entered it. But we think it's because they suddenly have a more opportunity to speak English and realize that there's a lot that they still need to learn, as well as with the writing. So those are some of the ways that we do the review. It's very data-driven, and it's on test scores. Now we have another question, and it is, let's see. All right. Let's see. As Libby comes into her new position, what are her national priorities for ELL students?
That's a great question, and I could summarize both your presentation and Rosann's presentation to emphasize absolutely the whole question of how to balance a deficit approach to framing needs for ELL, which is to help build a case for why we need additional resources, support, and attention, but balancing that with a strengths-based approach which really talks about the gifts and the talents and the richness that ELL students bring to our education experiences. So we could talk about the contributions to a global economy perspective. We can talk about, in fact, I just spoke with one of my colleagues who is looking at this from a national security and investment perspective. So there's many approaches we can think about that would start to at least balance our use of language and framing of who our ELL students are. Because inevitably when we look only at the deficit approach, there's a tendency then to lower expectations and standards for, quote, those kids. So that's a number one, I think, top area to really consider, and both internally and externally, to talk about how we describe our students that would serve their best interests. Secondly, it's not just my vision for national priorities, but it is our vision. So it's very important and critical, which I have spent the last 2 weeks doing, is really listening and soliciting thoughts and experiences from not only my colleagues, but outside of the department in terms of how people are viewing what is happening with students. And as you know, everybody comes with a different personal experience or observations about how language is learned and the significance of culture in really leveraging, as Rosann talked about, leveraging and scaffolding learning is all part of a holistic picture. So my hope is that we think more systemically, and I'm glad you used Sanger as a case example, Lauren, because I did spend some time there. And what struck me is that their success is with all students. Yes, ELL, of course. But their approach has been very systematic and systemic, and you gave examples of how they started small, but immediately with success they grew it district-wide. So those would be the kinds of strategies I would hope to emphasize, that we think more comprehensively and more holistically in how we meet the needs of ELL students.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one final question that we've received, and it's for Rosann. And it says, regarding the policy recommendations that Rosann mentioned, are there any groups that are having success advocating for these recommendations at the state and or federal level?
I have one example, which is in Nevada, where community advocates, particularly in Las Vegas, have been successful in advocating for and leveraging funding targeted to ELLs from the state. So there was recently, I think, over $50 million allocated. Clark County School District, which includes Las Vegas, and over 3/4 of the state's English language learners are going to use that funding to focus on the schools in the district with the highest percentages of English language learners. They're going to be called Zoom schools, and for 2 years they're going to be putting in a range of supports for their English language learners in the hopes of improving student outcomes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we're getting close to the conclusion of the webinar. And I would like to thank Libby, Rosann, the Kellogg Foundation, and GFE for making this webinar possible. And of course, thank you for all the listeners, our funders who are interested in English language learners. What we'd like to do is suggest that you consider the 3 questions that are now on the screen in front of you. These are questions, some of them you might want to discuss with your colleagues, others you might want to answer directly. And we particularly are interested in the third one, letting us know how GFE can assist you with funding for ELLs. And as we've heard, there is such a great need for funding for programs for English language learners. And there also is quite a bit of information about programs which are working, and I think that many of them are looking at evaluating it through the data. So it's very reliable information. I believe that as funders of education, we have great opportunities and responsibilities to help improve education for ELLs, who are a dynamic and growing population. Our students, including our ELLs, are our future scientists, teachers, healthcare providers, community leaders, and ambassadors. They need and deserve our support. And I think it's exciting that there's increasing organizations, including GFE, that are looking at how to provide this kind of support for ELLs. There also are a number of universities that are collaborating with some of the funders and school districts to help look at not just professional development, but look at how they can analyze data. Because for many school districts that are small, it's rather overwhelming, and they oftentimes don't have the technology to conduct the type of studies that the universities are doing for us. I now would like to ask Kimberlyn to share a few comments.
Yes, thank you so much for doing a great job moderating, Lauren, and thanks everyone for participating today. I want to share just a few announcements from GFE. First, the annual conference we're hosting is Philanthropy Rising to the Challenge. It will take place in Houston, Texas, October 16th through 18th, so we're looking forward to seeing all of our colleagues that are registered for the conference. Secondly, please keep your eyes peeled for information on Part 2 of GFE's Common Core webinar series for place-based funders in mid-November. And finally, please save the date for GFE's Grantmakers Institute at Harvard University. It will be May 5th through 7th. And now for a few closing thoughts. As a reminder, the full webinar presentation will be available on GFE's website and/or via email. We'll also follow up later today to provide you with an evaluation of today's program, as well as give you an opportunity to discover sort of ways that GFE can be helpful in your grant making in this area. The survey is short, so please take just 5 minutes to fill it out. Your comments definitely help us improve our program. Again, thanks everyone for participating, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.